So we're here with Edwin BLACK, and most people know you for some of the bestsellers, some of the books that Mitchell has just referred to. IBM, The Holocaust, War Against the Weak, Internal Combustion, Banking on Baghdad. All of these books, bestsellers, were written, however, in the 21st century. You have, I understand, somewhere around 69 different editions, published in about 14 languages in 61 countries. The question that we're focusing on today was actually your first book, called The Transfer Agreement, the dramatic story of the pact between the Third Reich and Jewish Palestine. Let's be sure we define the Zionists. Those are the people who, what were they doing?
The Zionists? I believe that most people don't know what the word Zionism means.
Let's start with that.
Well, at the end of the 19th century, there were a number of nationalistic movements across Europe. There was the concept of Armenian nationalism, there was East European nationalism, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. There was a wide group of people who were seeking to self-govern. One of these many groups was the Jewish people, and Zionism is nothing more than Jewish nationalism.
So we're talking the Jewish nationalists.
The Jewish nationalists, the Zionists, seeking to legally organize themselves into a state under international law, which was done through the League of Nations, sought to move the Jews who were persecuted, especially in Europe, into Jewish Palestine. Most people today think of Palestinians as Arabs, but the entire world in 1933 thought the word Palestinian meant Jewish nationalist,
Jews, right.
Zionist. The Jewish Agency for Palestine, the Palestine Post, Jewish Palestine. That's why the subtitle of the book is Jewish Palestine, because that was the body of the Jews in what became the State of Israel. It was called Jewish Palestine, and the term for the Jews, internationally recognized in ordinary parlance and officially, was Palestinian. So they used to refer to Jews as Palestinians.
So these Zionists, who were the advocates then for a Jewish homeland, pick up our story in terms of the controversy.
They saw the end before anyone saw the end. And they said the only thing that we can do to save a remnant, because they saw it coming, they knew the history of the Jews, the recent history and the distant history. They saw it coming, and they made a deal with the Reich to transfer out the Jews of Nazi Germany and other parts of Europe into Palestine. Now, how are you going to do that? That's going to be impossible, because who's running Palestine? Palestine is being run by the British. It is being run under the so-called mandate system, which means the League of Nations mandated Palestine, which was Turkish territory before that, to be a Jewish homeland. But there were rules in place. And the rules, and this is important, the rules were that Jews could not enter Palestine without $5,000 in cash or 1,000 British pounds. And this was called the so-called capitalist immigration certificate. Now, how does a Jew leave Nazi Germany, where there are currency restrictions, where no one can bring a Reichsmark out of Germany? How does that Jew get into Palestine as a so-called official refugee? The answer is the Germans concocted the idea, and the Zionists concocted it with them, that German goods would be sold. And as German goods were sold, money would be produced. A Jew in Germany, in this complex arrangement, would take his personal household possessions and assets and put them in a special bank. And that bank was called Pal Troy. Then a second bank was set up called the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and that bank was in Palestine. The money would be put into the German bank. The Nazi goods would be sold by the Zionist Organization across the Middle East, and especially in Palestine. When the goods were sold, they generated revenue, which went into the Anglo-Palestine Bank. The Anglo-Palestine Bank then provided the money for the Jews to bypass the currency restriction that the British had imposed, and they would come in. In the process, the Nazis could restore their economy. The Nazis could break the boycott, because you could not transfer a Jew by selling the goods and at the same time boycott the goods. The infrastructure of Jewish Palestine was built up. Pipes, steel, breweries, homes, cars, buses, all of these things German made. And I wondered when I first went to Israel, why are there so many Mercedes-Benz running
Everybody
around?
asked that question.
We all
Sure.
asked that
Right.
question.
Right.
And that's where I really start book and explained how it happened. And in the process, 25 years ago, I was the first one to talk about the economic consequences of the Holocaust. At that time, people said, why are you talking assets? They were still trying to comprehend the enormity, the scope of the bloodshed. How many people died? How many people were gassed? How many trains were there? People were not talking about money. Now, today, that dominates the conversation as assets. I want my property back. I want my insurance back. I want all these things back.
Sure.
But in those days, it was all almost blasphemous. It was a few decades ahead of its time to discuss the money consequences. But I realized that the scope of the bloodshed was in many ways linked to the economic impact of the Holocaust. In addition, I was the first one to use the word Nazi and Zionist in the same sentence. Now it is today everywhere, especially by the enemies of the Jewish state.
This book was published in 1984, so it's been 25 years ago. And at the time that it came out, I remember there was a tremendous amount of media attention, and also it was a very controversial book. It was one that there was a tremendous amount of discussion about it, and so that's really what brings us here today. Let's go first to that issue. What was it about the publication of this book and the thesis that you were putting forth? What was it that garnered so much attention and so much controversy?
The story of the transfer agreement is the story of the pact between the Zionists and the Nazis that was launched in the first weeks of the Third Reich in 1933. It began in the spring of 1933 and was consummated in August of 1933. Most people don't know that when Hitler came to power, the Jews actually fought back, and they fought back hard, and they fought back immediately. Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933. The first concentration camp was actually opened up a series of them between March 8th and March 10th of 1933. The anti-Jewish laws followed shortly thereafter. And by March 27th of 1933, the Jewish war veterans had actually started a series of international protests and marches. And on March 27th of 1933, 1 million protesters jammed Madison Square Garden, and there were boycott and protest movements all over the globe, led by the Jews, but certainly involving the interfaith community, the labor unions, anyone who wanted to profit at Germany's expense and to protest the Nazi regime.
So we're talking, this is about 10, 12 years before the onset of World War II.
World War II began at 6 a.m. on September 30th, 1939.
So, right.
So we're talking, Hitler came to power in 33, the Nuremberg Laws in 35, Kristallnacht in 1938, the war in 1939, and most of the genocidal period, the so-called final solution, I guess, would have begun in the summer of 1941, the fall of 1941, and then commencing at full speed in 1943, 4, and 5. So what the Zionists did was they realized that protest was fruitless.
Let's take a moment. To all Americans, as well as Jews, especially.
No, it wasn't just Americans. It was in Czechoslovakia. It was in England. It was in France.
Saying don't buy goods coming out of
Don't buy German goods and services.
Was there opposition to that, by the way, boycott, or was there?
Yes, there was opposition within the American Jewish community. It's very easy for people who look at the American Jewish community today and falsely believe it's monolithic. But you and I both know that the Jewish community back in the 30s was anything but monolithic.
Sure.
It's a very complex story, but the Jewish community was comprised, the Jewish leadership in this country was mainly run by what were known as German Jews, Hofjuden, which is the courtly Jews.
They didn't want to rock the boat so much.
Not only did they not rock the boat, they had led all the vigorous boycotts and protests against the Tsar, against France, against Damascus. They were the ones who fought back whenever Jews were persecuted. And whether or not the regime in question, the Tsar, would take retaliation or revenge upon the inhabitants was never an issue. They always had to stand up for Jewish rights.
Okay.
And they successfully defended Jewish rights all over the planet. In this case, the Jews who would be retaliated against were not some Russian guy called Sasha. This would now be their uncle Heinrich, their cousin, their daughter. It would hit home.
So they were afraid there would be a backlash against Jews in Germany, and some were counseling, wait a minute, we should back off on this.
Yes, and who am I talking about? Let's get names. American Jewish Committee. They were anti-Zionist.
In those days.
In those days, not now, of course. And B'nai B'rith, anti-Zionist, and also German Jewish in its major composition. And these guys wanted to work quietly, behind the scenes, petitioning government officials. They wanted nothing to do with any vigorous protest against Nazi Germany. Contrast that with the other Jewish organization, not the committees and the elite, but the democratic Jewish people. And that was the Eastern Jews, the so-called American Jewish Congress. It's really like labor and management.
Sure.
It was really the population against the elite, and the population said, we're going to protest this. We're going to not. And what did they have to protest? What was the weapon that the average Jew had to fight Hitler? The money in their pocket. That was it.
And not to use it for Nazi goods in Germany.
And not to use it for Nazi goods. Now, at the same time, what are we talking about? The height of the Depression. So, if you're going to boycott German pharmaceuticals and China and film and other goods and services for Czechoslovakian, French, American, lots of people are going to join that. Labor unions, the Czechoslovakians, Catholics who were outraged by what was being done in Germany, Protestants. This was interracial, this was non-sectarian. True, it was led by the Jews, but they were very careful to be all-inclusive and never call this a Jewish boy, a Jewish boy.
Let's also keep in mind, there's also the nativist movement in America in the 1930s.
That's right.
The Jewish community was nowhere near as well organized or as willing to take positions